March 15th, 44 BC. The Ides of March. You're standing just outside the Curia of Pompeii. Inside it smells like old stone blood and oil lamps. Moments ago, 23 blades entered one man's body. Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator for life, now lies at the foot of a statue. It's not his statue, it's Pompey's. Ironic, really. Some warned him. So many did. Beware the Ides of March, they said. He didn't. And now, you're standing here, heartbeat loud in your ears, your hands still slick. You told yourself this would save Rome, that the Republic would thank you. But Rome is quiet. Too quiet. You're not sure anyone will thank you at all. By the end of this story, you'll know what happened to everyone who raised a knife that day. What time is it? Where you are, midnight, 2 a.m. Dim the lights. Let your shoulders relax. Take a breath. You're not safe. You're not home. You're in Rome. And you just helped murder Caesar. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Sleep with History channel. After that, please leave a comment and let us know what famous historical event you would like to hear about. You weren't always a conspirator. Once, you just lived in Rome among friends under skies that didn't feel so heavy. You wake up to the sound of sandals scraping against marble. Someone sweeping. Again. You've been staying in this borrowed villa for 3 nights now. It belongs to a friend of a senator, and no one wants to ask whose it actually is. The floor is cold. Even in spring, Roman stone holds onto the night. You sit up and look around. The walls are painted vines, birds, some half-faded god, holding grapes. There's no window in your room, just a high slit near the ceiling that lets in the dusty morning light. You slept in your clothes. You don't remember doing that before. Your sandals are still damp from the Tiber. You think of going home, but is that even safe anymore? There's a servant moving quietly in the atrium. She doesn't meet your eyes. You used to get nods, polite greetings. Now people look past you, like you're already a ghost. Breakfast is already laid out in the triclinium. Bread, olives, a hard cheese that smells like wet straw, and a little leftover lamb from last night. The wine is sour, watered down, but it's still wine. It's always wine. No one talks. The men who sat beside you in the Senate now chew in silence. One of them, Casca, maybe keeps rubbing his temple. Another hasn't touched his plate. You reach for an olive, and your hand shakes. No one comments, but you feel the glances. You try to eat, but it feels wrong. You stabbed a man yesterday. You watched him fall, clutching his robes like he was trying to hold his own insides in. You remember the way his mouth opened, like he was trying to say something, but all that came out was blood. You bite into the bread and taste ash. You chew and chew and chew, but your throat stays tight. This food could be a feast, but it might as well be dust. You were taught that Rome is eternal, that the Republic is sacred, that no man should hold too much power, not even Caesar. You grew up listening to your father speak Cicero's words with reverence. You memorized speeches about liberty, balanced the Senate's strength. You believed in law, in honor, in the old ways. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, something in you broke. Rome wasn't supposed to be like that, ruled by one man, one voice. He said he was saving the Republic, but his name was chanted in the Forum like a god's. Statues, temples, festivals. People gave up their freedoms with cheers. They wanted bread games and someone to tell them what to do. That wasn't Rome. That was something else. So when the time came, when Brutus whispered and Cassius planned, you said yes. Not because you hated Caesar, but because you loved the Republic more. At least, you thought that's why. After breakfast, you step out onto the portico. The sky is gray, low, and heavy. Rome should be buzzing this time of morning carts, rolling slaves, shouting the smell of fresh bread and wet stone. But today feels muted. There's a tension in the air like the city is holding its breath. A boy runs past barefoot, eyes wide. He doesn't look back. You hear a whisper from 2 women down the street. Antony spoke all night. They're saying, "Caesar didn't cry out." One of them catches your gaze and falls silent. Someone has drawn a crude dagger on the temple wall across from you. Below it, the word traitor. You feel something twist in your stomach. Last night, you were a liberator, a defender of old Rome. Today, you're just a man with blood on your hands and a name that's starting to rot in the air. You knew it would happen today. You'd known for days, maybe weeks, and yet your hands are cold. Not with fear, not exactly, but with something heavier, something ancient. You woke early, dressed carefully. The toga wasn't white, not exactly. More of a pale bone color lined with dust from the night before. You hadn't eaten. The wine you poured tasted sour, and you spilled some trying to lift the cup. Your fingers shook then, too. The forum was quiet that morning. Too quiet for Rome. You heard a dog bark once in the distance. No bells, no crowds. Just the faint slap of sandals on stone. You arrived at the Curia of Pompeii earlier than most. A few senators were already there. Cassius greeted you with a nod, nothing more. Brutus stood by the entrance, speaking with someone in hushed tones. His jaw was tight. His eyes wouldn't meet yours. The plan was simple, or so they said. You'd surround him during the session, wait for the signal. The others would strike first. You'd follow. Fast, clean, righteous. But nothing about it felt righteous. Caesar entered later than expected. The sun caught the gold on his laurel wreath as he passed. He smiled at someone, maybe Trebonius, maybe not, and his voice carried through the chamber like it always did, calm, measured, unafraid. He never even reached his seat. The first blow came from behind. You don't remember who struck it. Maybe Casca, maybe Cimber, maybe someone else entirely. You just remember the sound, not the scream, not yet, but the thud. Like someone dropped a sack of wet cloth onto marble. Then chaos. Caesar turned, stumbled. His mouth opened. Blood already soaking his robe, dripping from his side. Another blade cut across his shoulder, another to the thigh. He tried to move to speak. His hand reached out, grasping at nothing. Then Brutus stepped forward. You saw Caesar's eyes widen, just for a second, and then something in them fell away. He didn't say et tu Brute, that's not how it happened. He just stopped resisting. That's when your hand moved. You don't remember deciding to. You just were. One of the blades in motion. One more cut. You felt it catch on fabric, then something softer, warmer. He collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue. Blood on stone, on your hands, on the Senate floor. It was quiet suddenly. No shouting, just the rasp of breath. Someone sobbing. Maybe even you. Cassius whispered something, a prayer, a name, before stumbling back from the body. You heard sandals retreating fast. A servant dropped a scroll and ran. You just stood there, watching. His blood pooled beneath him, thick and dark. It didn't look real. Not like in battle. This was slower, sadder. There were 23 wounds, they would later say. But it only took one to end a republic. And now, you're still standing there. Hands shaking, robe stained, history changed. You thought you'd feel something noble, heroic, vindicated. Instead, all you feel is cold. You can't stop looking at him. Brutus hasn't moved in minutes. He's still standing where he last struck, arm half-lowered, eyes fixed on Caesar's body. He's breathing through his mouth slowly, like someone trying to hold back a wave of sickness or sorrow. Maybe both. The others are shifting. Cassius is already whispering something about leaving quickly. Trebonius has stepped back, wiping his blade on the hem of his toga, like the blood is just wine he spilled at dinner. But Brutus, he's frozen. You didn't expect that. He was the one who spoke with the most certainty. The one who said this wasn't murder, it was medicine. That Rome needed surgery. That the Republic would bleed, but only so it could heal. Now he just stands there. You watch him as you catch your breath. You wonder what he's thinking, or if he's thinking at all. Is he counting the wounds? Is he remembering Caesar's voice, how it used to call him my son, even though they weren't related? Or is he remembering his real father, the Brutus who stood against tyranny generations ago, the name that meant resistance? A few hours ago, that name sounded noble. Now in this room with Caesar's body at its feet, it sounds hollow. Brutus finally speaks. His voice is quieter than you've ever heard it. People will understand. He says it like a prayer, or a question. You don't answer. No one does. The light from the skylight catches in the blood pooling on the floor. You think of Caesar's shadow, how long it was when he entered the curia, and how short it is now. Someone coughs. Someone else stumbles against a bench. The chamber has begun to stink copper and sweat and fear. You look again at Brutus. He lifts his eyes, just a little, like he's trying to see something through the ceiling. Maybe the heavens, maybe his own conscience. You don't know. And then finally he turns to leave. Not fast, not proud, just walking, like the weight of what he's done is strapped across his back. You follow because you have to, because the others are already moving, slipping into the light of the portico like nothing happened, like Rome isn't going to remember this moment forever. As you pass Brutus in the hallway, he stops beside a column. His hand is trembling. You think he might speak again, say something wise, something noble. Instead, he just whispers, "We have to go." You nod, not because you agree, but because your legs are already moving. Cassius speaks before the door even closes behind you. "We need to send messages," he mutters, pacing. "To Cicero, to Decimus, to every man who still believes in the Republic." He hasn't even wiped the blood off his hands. You're back in the borrowed villa. The others have trickled in behind you, some pale, some shaking, some saying nothing at all. But Cassius is alive with movement. His eyes flick from man to man, from shadow to light, as if he's already calculating what comes next. You've seen him like this before, planning, mapping, drawing circles around people's names. Cassius doesn't act on passion. He acts on strategy. The first time you met him, he was speaking in metaphors, storms and ships and anchors. But what he meant always was power. He could talk about liberty, and maybe he believed in it, but you knew he cared most about control, about leverage, about not being beneath anyone again. Even Caesar, especially Caesar. Now he grabs a wax tablet and begins to scrawl with a stylus, muttering names as he writes. Lepidus, no too close to Antony. Piso, possibly. And what about Plancus? He's always waited to see which way the wind blows. You sit down slowly. The wine jug is still on the table from last night. You pour some into a cup, and it spills a little. Your hands are less steady than you'd like. Cassius keeps talking. We need a statement, something public, something noble. Rome must know this was for her, that we aren't murderers. No one answers. Brutus is sitting in the corner, staring at his feet. Cinna is chewing his lip until it bleeds. Trebonius is outside throwing up again. Cassius doesn't notice, or pretends not to. He's in motion, moving from the atrium to the garden, speaking as if there's an audience. We saved them, he says. They'll understand once we explain. Caesar was becoming a king. He would have ended the Senate, the courts, the centuries of balance. He trails off. For a moment, just a heartbeat, his voice breaks. He looks down at his palms, like he's just now registering the red beneath his nails. Then the mask returns. I'll go to Cicero, he says. He'll speak for us. He has words the people still trust. You nod, not because you believe him, but because it's easier than arguing. You think of yesterday, Cassius pacing like this, drawing lines in the sand with his finger. History will praise us, he said. We will be remembered as saviors. And now he says it again, but this time, his voice is softer, like he's saying it for himself. You sip your wine. It tastes like iron. You thought the worst was behind you. The blade had done its work. Caesar was dead. The Senate had been cleansed, as Cassius put it. All that remained was order rebuilding, convincing Rome that what happened wasn't murder. It was duty. But then Mark Antony spoke. You weren't there at first. You heard about the funeral from a distance, whispers from the market, murmurs on the street. But by the time you arrived at the forum, the crowd had already swelled. Thousands pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, beneath the spring sun. There were flowers too many for mourning, and incense that stuck to your skin. You stood at the back, cloaked, hood up. No one recognized you. Not yet. And then you heard his voice. Antony didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He didn't even cry. He just stood beside the body, wrapped in bloodied robes, and spoke like a man grieving a friend. They called him ambitious, Antony said, and yet he brought peace. He fed the poor. He turned down a crown 3 times, the crowd murmured. Antony lifted the robe, the very one Caesar wore when you struck. He held it high, turning it so they could see the holes, the stains. You saw fingers rise to mouths, eyes begin to shine. Here, he said, pointing to one of the cuts, is where Brutus stabbed him. A gasp. Someone dropped a bundle of flowers. A woman began to wail. He trusted them, Antony said. He loved them, and they butchered him. You felt the shift. It was almost physical, like the Forum had inhaled all at once and then exhaled rage. They lit the pyre right there. Not in the field of Mars, as tradition said, but on the steps of the Forum itself. They broke benches, tore down market stalls, fed fire with anything they could find. And when the flames rose, so did the fury. They must pay, someone shouted. Burn their houses, another echoed. You didn't wait to hear more. You turned, walked fast, then faster. You told yourself it was nothing, just emotion, a funeral. Grief makes people dramatic. But in your chest, something cracked. Antony hadn't told them to riot. He didn't need to. He gave them grief, and they turned it into fire. You expected parades. Not literal ones. You're not that naive, but something like respect. A nod in the street, a murmur of approval. Maybe even a letter slipped under the door thanking you for saving the Republic. Instead, the streets feel colder now, and quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It's the quiet of people watching you, without speaking, stepping aside without meeting your eye. You walk through the Forum this morning, carefully cloak wrapped tight. You pass the statue of Saturn, where senators used to meet in daylight. There are no meetings now, only guards. A boy ran by with a scroll in his hand. You caught a glimpse of the seal, Antony's. The taverns are full of whispers. Some say you'll be rewarded. Others say you'll be executed. But no one says it to your face. The baker who used to smile at you now hands you bread without a word. The woman who once brought figs to the Senate now looks through you like smoke. You thought killing Caesar would restore order. Instead, it shattered trust. You visit Brutus in secret. He looks older already. His hands tremble when he drinks. He's been writing speeches, long, careful defenses, pages and pages of justification. He hasn't shared them with anyone. Cassius talks of new alliances, of making offers, of necessary concessions. He's quieter now, less theatrical. Cinna, the poet, was killed yesterday. Not the conspirator, the wrong Cinna, beaten in the street by a crowd that didn't care about his name. Just that it sounded Roman and familiar. That was enough. You saw the bloodstain, still fresh, the steps of the Temple of Castor and Pollux. No one cleaned it. No one dared. You pass a wall marked with red paint. Liberty dies with silence. Below it, someone had scratched out the last word and replaced it with you. You go home by back alleys now. You tell yourself Rome just needs time, that people will understand, but inside you feel the city turning, not away from Caesar, but away from you. It begins with the children. You pass through the market hood, low steps light. You used to walk here in full daylight, pausing to greet vendors, to sniff olives, and argue over coin. Today, you walk fast, and you don't make eye contact. A child spots you first, a boy, maybe 9. He tugs at his mother's sleeve and points. She looks at you. Her eyes narrow. She says nothing, just pulls him close and turns away. Then another voice calls out, not to you, not exactly, but loud enough. Look, one of them. You freeze. A man leaning on a cart locks eyes with you. There's something unreadable on his face. Not anger, not grief. Something colder, like you're a rat that wandered into daylight. You walk faster. Someone hisses, coward. Another voice follows, murderer. You don't look back. You don't run. You just keep walking. But your hands are sweating now. You feel every sound, every whisper. The Forum is worse. A crowd has gathered, not for a speech, not for a trial, just standing, murmuring, watching the pyre of Caesar still smolder at the far end. You don't go near it. You turn down a side street, but even there, eyes follow. Rome is changing. It's in the air, heavier, somehow more charged. People walk in groups now. They speak in lower tones. They look behind them more often. There's graffiti, spreading fast and angry, daggers painted in red, the name Brutus crossed out and replaced with butcher. A friend or someone you once thought of as one closes his door before you can knock. You don't blame him. At night, you hear footsteps outside your window. More than once. Sometimes they stop. Sometimes they linger. Once a stone hit the wall near your door. You didn't sleep after that. Brutus suggests laying low. Cassius says the people will calm. Give it a week, he mutters, they always forget. But they're not forgetting. They're remembering differently. To them, Caesar wasn't a threat. He was food, coin, games, safety. You didn't kill a tyrant. You killed the father of cheap grain and strong walls. And now, you're not a liberator. You're a name whispered like a curse. And you're running out of places to hide. You hear about her before you see her. Whispers again, a servant mumbling something about the lady of the house refusing to eat. Someone else mentions her pacing barefoot through the garden, at night speaking to no one. And then one morning Brutus sends for you. You arrive through the back, cloaked and silent. The villa is quieter than you remember. The fountain in the atrium no longer runs. No musicians, no slaves bustling between rooms. Just stillness, the kind that soaks into walls and won't leave. Brutus greets you with a nod. His face is hollowed. He looks like he hasn't slept. You don't ask questions, you follow. She's in her chamber, sitting on the floor, back against the wall, her hair unbound. Her hands rest in her lap, clenched white-knuckled. There's a scroll beside her, unread, unimportant. She doesn't look at you. She won't eat, Brutus says quietly. She speaks, but only of shadows. You try to speak her name, Portia. It catches in your throat. She was always strong, sharper than most men in the Senate. You remember the way she spoke once about honor, not as decoration, but as discipline. She told Brutus once that she wouldn't be married to a coward. He laughed then. You all did. It was a compliment. Now she barely breathes. She speaks suddenly, voice low. He bled like any man. Did you see it? Neither of you answers. I thought it would feel righteous. Her eyes are distant. I prayed. Lit candles, spoke Cicero's words aloud. But now, the gods are silent. Brutus kneels beside her, gently places a hand on hers. She doesn't pull away, but she doesn't move either. She hears voices at night, he tells you later. Thinks Caesar walks the halls. You believe him. You've heard them too. Over the next few days, she fades, refuses food, speaks less. One morning you find her walking in circles barefoot on cold marble. Her feet are cut. She doesn't notice. Brutus doesn't leave her side now. His speeches are abandoned, his letters unfinished. He holds her hand when she sleeps, though she often wakes screaming. One night you hear her say, he trusted you. It's not clear who she means. Maybe all of you, maybe none of you. And then one morning she's gone. They say it was fever, that her heart was weak, that the stress was too much. But later, someone admits she swallowed fire. You don't ask what that means. You already know. It happens quietly. No dramatic speech, no thunder of applause. Just a closed-door meeting in a modest villa across the river. You weren't invited. Lepidus moves fast, faster than anyone expected. A month ago, he was just a footnote in the Senate. A man with soldiers but no spark. A shadow standing behind Caesar's chair. Now, he controls the army. Word spreads in pieces, a garrison swears loyalty, a general accepts a bribe, an old ally switches sides without explanation. No one sees the full picture. Not yet, but you feel it in your bones. Brutus calls a meeting. Fewer men come this time. Too many are sick. Some are simply missing. Cassius paces the floor, voice tight. He's consolidating. That's what this is. A slow coup. You watch Brutus sip watered wine. He hasn't shaved in days. He stares into the cup like it might reveal something. He's no Caesar, someone says. You want to believe that, but something about that makes it worse. Lepidus doesn't have Caesar's charisma. He doesn't need it. He has the legions, the pay chests, the silence of men who prefer order to glory. By the end of the week, the Senate has voted him Pontifex Maximus, chief priest. The title isn't just ceremonial. It means he controls the calendar, the courts, the rituals of the gods. Brutus says it's an insult to Caesar's memory. You say nothing, because you know the truth, it's not an insult. It's a replacement. You visit a friend in the guard, or someone you thought was a friend. He doesn't let you in. Says he has orders. His tone is flat, like he's reciting from memory. You walk home in the dark. The city feels different now. Not hostile exactly, but managed. That night, someone posts a notice on the Senate door, Rome remembers. Rome obeys. And underneath, in smaller script, the knives were not the end. You lie awake until dawn, listening for footsteps. Not from Caesar's ghost, but from soldiers. At first, you barely noticed him. He was just a boy, pale thin, polite. Barely 20, no armor, no scars, no thunder in his voice. Just quiet confidence and a name that carried too much weight, Gaius Octavius. Caesar's great-nephew, his legal heir. You remember scoffing the first time his name came up. A child can't claim an empire, Cassius had said, and everyone nodded. Brutus just frowned. But Octavian didn't need your approval. He already had Caesar's name, and soon he had something better: Caesar's loyalty, the loyalty of his veterans. It started small: letters, coin, promises, then legions, not all at once. Just a few commanders who happened to change their allegiance. A few units who marched not for the Senate, but for the boy who called himself Caesar's son. You read his proclamations in disbelief, written like a statesman, not a youth, full of words like honor, duty, justice. He didn't call you traitors, not yet. He didn't have to. His message was clear, I remember. He remembered the betrayal, the blood on marble, the ash in the air from the funeral pyre, and he promised to make it matter. You heard someone laugh once, say Octavian wouldn't last a month, that Antony would crush him, or the Senate would discard him. But days passed, then weeks, and Octavian didn't fall. He grew. Brutus tried to write to him, tried to open a line of reason to explain that it wasn't personal, that it was about the Republic. Octavian never answered. You hear he's gathering more men now, veterans, young nobles, even a few ex-consuls who see where the wind is blowing. And then the statues begin to change. Old busts of Caesar, once cracked or covered, are cleaned and displayed again. Laurel wreaths return. Crowds leave flowers at altars. And in the Forum, someone chisels a phrase into a public wall. Vengeance belongs to Caesar's blood. You don't know if Octavian wrote it, but you know he believes it. And worse, so does Rome. You always admired Cicero. Even when he talked too much. Even when his speeches circled back on themselves like a man arguing with his own shadow. He was Rome, or at least what Rome thought it should be: elegant, learned, sharp-tongued, and just a little too clever for his own good. He didn't join the conspiracy. He said it was too dangerous, said that bloodshed couldn't restore the Republic. And yet, once Caesar was gone, he reappeared like a senator reborn. His voice filled the Forum again. Not in defense of you, or Brutus, or Cassius Numpier, but against Antony. You remember the first Philippic, like thunder after drought. His voice rang out, accusing Antony of tyranny, of ambition, of corruption. He called for the Republic to rise again, called Octavian a boy to be praised, trained, and empowered. You flinched when you heard it. You could almost feel the trap opening under his feet. Octavian tolerated Cicero's praise, but he didn't need it. And Antony remembered every word. Still, Cicero kept going. 12 speeches, 12 blows in public, each one louder than the last. He thought words could reshape the world the way he once had that with Catiline. He believed in the Senate, in law, in philosophy. He didn't believe in swords. Until it was too late. You remember the day his name appeared on the list. The proscriptions were formal, now not whispers, not threats. Names printed on plaques, death sentences backed by coin, kill a man on the list, and you could keep part of his estate. Refuse, and you might find your own name added. When Cicero heard he'd been named, he didn't run. He went to his villa by the sea, sat in the garden, let the wind tangle his robes. Some say he tried to flee. Others say he simply waited. They found him in the morning. He didn't beg. He bared his neck. They took his head. And to make sure no one forgot what happens to voices that sting too sharply, they took his hands too. Those same hands that wrote so much of Rome's soul. Brutus didn't speak for hours after he heard. Cassius broke a cup in silence. You said nothing, just stared at your own hands and wondered how long until they come for yours. It starts with a list, not a speech, not a riot, just a slab of wood nailed to a column in the forum. On it, 20 names written in clear, careful script. No explanation, no pretense. At the top, Cicero. Below him, senators, knights, landowners. Near the bottom, someone you once drank with on the Palatine. You stare at it too long. A man beside you spits. A woman walks past with her eyes on the ground. No one reads aloud. Everyone reads in silence. Then the second list appears. Then the third. Each one longer. Each one more familiar. They call it a political measure, a cleansing, a necessary evil to restore balance. But in the streets, it has another name, the harvest. Brutus says it's barbaric. Cassius calls it cowardice, but neither of them can stop it. The triumvirate Octavian, Antony, Lepidus now rules by committee. They vote on names, people you know, people who helped you, people who did nothing. The rules are simple. Anyone named can be killed without trial. Their property goes to the state. Anyone sheltering them shares their fate. And the reward's gold, land, favor. It becomes efficient. Neighbors turn on neighbors. Brothers disappear. Some try to bribe their way off the list. Few succeed. You start locking your doors. You stop answering knocks. Once you pass a man whose sandals are stained with blood, he doesn't look guilty. He looks wealthy. Whispers start following you. You imagine your name being spoken behind doors passed in candlelight. One morning you walk past the forum and see someone pointing. Just for a second. You don't go home that night. Cassius sends you a message. Leave Rome. Now. You hesitate. You want to believe it will pass, that reason will return. But then on the fifth list, your cousin's name appears. You visit his house. It's empty. Not looted, erased. His neighbors say they didn't see anything. The city smells different now, like wax, like blood, like paper burned too fast to leave ash. You sleep in a cellar for 3 nights. On the 4th night, a child knocks at the door and hands you a note. No seal, just 2 words, run now. You don't ask who sent it. You leave before dawn. You don't say goodbye. You never see that street again. You meet him one last time in a dusty villa outside Capua, half-shuttered, echoing with the sounds of packing. Brutus doesn't look like himself anymore. His beard has grown in patches and his cloak hangs too loose across his shoulders. But his voice, when he speaks, still carries that same strange calm. We'll go to Greece, he says. There are still those who believe. You don't ask who. You don't want to know how few are left. Cassius is already there, gathering ships and soldiers, mercenaries, leftovers from older wars, the scraps of dying loyalty stitched together into something that might still resemble an army. You stay long enough to eat with Brutus one last time. Lentils, olives, a bit of salted fish. No wine. You sit in silence as he writes something, a letter. A poem, maybe his will. He folds it neatly. You should come, he says. You look away. Because you know what he doesn't want to say. There's nothing left here. Not for him. Not for you. Rome is no longer your city. It belongs to Octavian now, or Antony, or whatever the two of them become together. The ship leaves at dawn. You don't go with them. You watch from the hills as the sails shrink into the horizon. white fabric cutting across a pale sea. A small hope carried eastward. Somewhere out there, Brutus will try to raise the standard of the Republic again. He'll walk among philosophers and warriors invoking old names. He'll gather men who still believe. But you stay behind. Not because you're brave, because you're tired. And because you're not sure which is worse, dying a hunted man in Rome or dying a remembered one in Greece. You weren't there when it happened. But you heard the story, over and over from different mouths, each version the same where it mattered. Cassius died because he didn't wait long enough. The Battle of Philippi began in confusion. Dust clouds, shouts in Latin and Greek, standards raised and torn down. No clear lines, no signal fires, just chaos the kind only civil war can summon. Cassius, ever the tactician, took the western side. His men held the high ground. Brutus commanded the eastern flank. They planned well, rehearsed every formation, knew the stakes. But war doesn't follow scripts. On the second day, Cassius watched from his tent as enemy banners advanced, or so he thought. What he didn't know was that Brutus's forces had succeeded on the far side. Octavian's men were retreating, but the dust blurred everything. He sent a scout, a fast, loyal man, to confirm. The scout vanished into the haze and never returned. Cassius waited, minutes, then more. And then slowly the report started. We're surrounded. Brutus has fallen. The line is broken. They weren't true. But in that moment, they were all he had. So Cassius did what he always promised he would. He turned away from the battlefield, found a quiet spot near a grove of withered fig trees, called for his freedmen. He covered his face and ordered the man to drive the blade into him. He died thinking Brutus was dead. He died believing the Republic had already lost. And not long after, the scout returned, alive, smiling, carrying news of a partial victory. Too late. When word reached Brutus, he didn't speak, just stared at the horizon for a long time. The sun was setting, the air was thick with ash and blood, and the breath of men too tired to keep cheering. Cassius the strategist, the planner, the man who saw through everyone, even Caesar. Outwitted by dust. You learn all this from a messenger weeks later. The letter is unsigned, but the wax seal is familiar. You run your thumb over it like it might still be warm. Cassius is gone. One half of the rebellion lies buried in foreign soil. And the other half is next. Brutus holds the sword himself. He doesn't flinch, doesn't ask for help. He just kneels in the dust, kisses the pommel once, and leans in slowly like sleep, not death, is waiting on the other side. But you're not there to see it. No one is, really. Just a handful of men loyal to the very end. The same few who crossed the sea with him. The ones who still speak of Cicero with reverence, who still dream of a Senate with real power and streets ruled by law, not coin. They hold back their grief because Brutus told them to. He said, "Do not mourn the end of Rome, mourn the forgetting of it." You hear the story days later, as you sit alone in a farmhouse near the coast. The messenger brings nothing but a single line written on parchment, now stained with sweat and sun. Brutus is dead. The dream is buried beside him. He died 2 weeks after Cassius. Not in battle, not from wounds, but from something heavier, the weight of failure. The second battle at Philippi did not go well. Octavian and Antony had learned. Their troops were steadier, their promises richer. Your side, if it can still be called yours, broke before noon. Brutus tried to rally them, rode across the line on a dusty gray horse calling names, invoking ancestors. But their eyes had already dimmed. They had no more to give. He fled only far enough to find a grove, olive trees silent and windless. He handed his sword to a friend, one who wept and refused. So Brutus did it himself, just as his ancestor had done when the kings were cast out. But this time, there was no republic waiting to rise, just silence. The men buried him quickly. There was no ceremony, no marble, just earth. And then they disappeared, scattered, blended into villages, changed names, spoke less of honor and more of survival. You sit with that for a long time. Brutus, the last man who still believed in the words you once whispered with pride, Senatus Populusque Romanus. You used to write those letters at the top of every scroll, SPQR. Now you wonder if they'll mean anything a year from now, or if they'll just be carved into coins beneath Octavian's face. Rome has chosen, not the Republic, not Brutus, but memory and myth, and men who promise peace no matter the cost. You stare at your hands. They haven't held a sword in months, but they still remember the weight of one. He died before all this, before the knives, before the war, before the name Caesar became a dividing line across every Roman soul. But you knew what he stood for. Everyone did. Stubborn, unbending, honest to the point of pain. They said he would rather fall on his own sword than live in a world ruled by a tyrant. And he did. You used to speak his name like a spell. Cato the Younger, stoic, hero. The man who stood against Caesar when no one else dared. The man who walked away from comfort, who chose exile over compromise. Brutus worshipped him, carried copies of his speeches, quoted him over wine in whispers after Senate sessions in letters you now wish you'd kept. Now Brutus is gone. Cassius is gone. Cicero is gone. And Cato. Cato has been forgotten. The people no longer speak his name in reverence. If they remember him at all, it's with a shrug, a relic, an old fool who died for an idea that couldn't feed them or keep their streets safe. You walk through the forum, hooded, invisible. A boy plays in the corner where Cato once stood and read aloud. He builds something with stones, then knocks it over, laughing. There's no statue. There never was. Just a few broken memories tucked into old minds, men like you who remember what it felt like to believe that virtue was stronger than power. You visit an old friend, a senator who once quoted Cato with you years ago. He offers you wine, watered, cheap. He was too pure for politics, your friend says. That's why he lost. You don't answer, because part of you agrees, and part of you doesn't want to. That night, you open a scroll of Cato's maxims. You try to read, but the words feel distant like lines from a forgotten prayer. You read the same sentence 5 times. It doesn't stay. You set the scroll down. Outside, someone is chanting Octavian's name. A parade, a celebration of order restored, of peace, of Rome reborn. But you remember a different Rome, one built not on victory, but on principle. And you wonder, not for the first time, if that Rome ever existed at all. You never met her, but you heard her name long before Caesar died, whispered in corridors, cursed in Senate chambers, invoked like a storm cloud gathering over the Tiber. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, mother of Caesar's son, a woman who dared to sit beside him in public, who sailed up the Nile with purple sails surrounded by incense and gold, who refused to bow, not even to Rome. After Caesar's death, she vanished. Not literally, her palace still stood in Alexandria, her ships still patrolled the Delta, but from the eyes of Rome she became a rumor, a question mark. You thought she would flee, hide, collapse under the weight of Caesar's assassination, but she didn't. She waited. And while the men of Rome tore each other apart, while Brutus bled in Philippi, and Cicero's hands were nailed to the rostra, she watched, listened, chose her moment. And then she moved. Word spreads quietly. At first, Antony sails east, not as a conqueror, but as a guest. His legions need rest, his ambitions need funding, his heart perhaps needs soothing. No one says her name at first. Then suddenly, everyone does. Antony and Cleopatra. He arrives in Tarsus, she in a gilded barge, dressed as Isis, crowned in silver. He drinks with her for 10 nights. When he leaves changed. And the East begins to tilt. You read it in the letters, hear it in the wine shops, the senator's murmur of betrayal, The coin masters speak of grain routes. Rome's enemies begin to realign quietly toward Alexandria. Not because of war, because of her. She doesn't command with swords. She doesn't give speeches in the forum. She waits. And she offers something none of you could ever build a future. Not one bound to the Senate, not to the Republic, not even to Caesar. But to something older, something golden, a dynasty, a godchild born from the blood of pharaohs and Caesars. You remember the phrase carved near the port, "She doesn't need to conquer Rome. She only needs to outlive it." You don't know who wrote it, but you believe it. And as Octavian prepares his next move, you wonder if Cleopatra is already 10 moves ahead. It always starts the same way. You lie down, you close your eyes, the room is still. The fire has burned low. You've checked the bolts on the door twice. You tell yourself you're safe. But your mind doesn't care about locks. You hear footsteps first, not loud, just the soft scrape of sandals across marble. Then a whisper, like fabric moving in the dark. Then silence, long enough for your breath to quicken. You sit up. No one's there. But you feel it, the weight, like someone just left. Or is still watching. You haven't slept through the night in months. Some nights, it's dreams. Caesar turning toward you with empty eyes. Brutus bleeding in your arms. Cicero's mouth moving without sound, like he's still trying to finish one last sentence. Other nights, it's not dreams. You lie awake and remember things you didn't mean to keep. The way Caesar's blood hit your sandals. The look on a boy's face as he read your name on the third list. The sound of Portia's voice cracked and dry, saying nothing at all. You moved villas, then cities, then names. It didn't help. The ghosts follow. Not because they hate you, but because they can't leave either. You tried remedies, poppy seeds in wine songs, hummed at dusk prayers to gods you barely believe in anymore. Nothing works. Because what keeps you awake isn't fear. It's the question, was it worth it? You ask yourself that over and over. On cold nights, on bright mornings, in crowded streets where no one knows your face. In back rooms where old senators whisper about loyalty. You used to believe in things. Now you just believe in memory, and memory never sleeps. Tonight the moonlight cuts across the floor, pale and sharp like a blade drawn halfway. You lie on your side facing the wall, and for a moment, just a moment, you smell olive oil, laurel leaves, iron. You don't open your eyes, because you know who it would be. And you're not ready to see him again. The city feels different now. It still smells the same stone dust bread, the river. The same carts rattle down the same streets. The same children run barefoot past temples that haven't changed in centuries. But it's not the same Rome. There are new statues in the Forum, one of Octavian taller than any before, another of Caesar, restored and polished with fresh garlands around his feet. You pass it once by accident. You don't stop, you don't look. The shops still sell scrolls. But no one sells the speeches of Brutus anymore. Cicero is quoted only in jest. The books that once carried Cato's words have been replaced with war reports, poems praising the peacebringers. You wander, not as a fugitive, not anymore. That time has passed. You've become something quieter, smaller, a shadow of a shadow. No one recognizes you now. That should bring relief, but it doesn't. You see a boy in the market, wearing a brooch shaped like a dagger. He laughs when someone asks if it means rebellion. It's fashion, he says, from Alexandria. You buy olives from a vendor who once served senators. He doesn't mention the old days. Neither do you. You hear a rumor that your name was removed from the list, that someone powerful intervened, that you've been forgotten or forgiven. You don't ask if it's true. You keep your head down. One day you walk past the Curia. The steps have been scrubbed clean. No trace of blood, no cracked tiles, no memorial. Tourists walk past it like it's nothing. You feel something tighten in your chest. There's no plaque for what you did, no monument, no curse etched into stone. Just air and silence. You once helped kill the most powerful man in the world, and now you are just another Roman, one among thousands, a man who buys bread, who watches the sky, who says nothing when people talk of heroes. You wanted to save the Republic. Rome saved itself without you, and it doesn't even remember your name. You hear it from a neighbor, not directly, not cruelly, just a passing comment dropped like a stone into still water. They go by their mother's name now. Safer, I suppose. You nod. Pretend you didn't already know. Your children, the ones you taught to read with Cicero's letters, the ones you once carried through crowded festivals, their hands, sticky with honey, they no longer speak your name. Not in public. Maybe not even at home. You can't blame them. Rome doesn't punish treason forever, but it doesn't forget. And a name tied to the Ides of March that sticks. It stains. The boy, your eldest, he's grown now. You last saw him at the edge of a temple square, half turned, half vanishing into a crowd. You didn't call out. You weren't sure if he would turn or run. You receive a letter unsigned, written in a hand you recognize. Please don't come, it says. We are safe now. Don't change that. You fold it slowly, place it under a cracked tile beside your bed. You tell yourself it's enough. The younger one, your daughter, you don't know where she is. You heard something once about a villa in Capua. Married to a merchant, quiet life. You picture her laughing in a garden, pretending her father died in a storm. Maybe that's kinder. You think about names a lot now. Your father's name, your grandfather's, the ones carved into the family altar, each one once carried with pride. Now, erased, forgotten, or worse, deliberately removed. There are days when you don't speak at all, not for penance, not for drama, just because silence feels like the only honest thing left. You light a lamp at dusk like you always did when they were young, a habit, a hope. Sometimes you whisper their names into the dark, the real ones, the ones they no longer use, not to summon them back, just so they still exist somewhere, even if only in your mouth. Even if only in a whisper. It's just a coin. You hold it between your fingers at the market, a simple silver denarius worn smooth at the edges, still cold from the vendor's tray. You flip it once, absent-mindedly, and then you see the face. His face, Gaius Julius Caesar. Crowned with laurel, serene, immortal, frozen in profile like the blade never touched him, like he never bled out at the foot of Pompey's statue. Around the edges, dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. Your breath catches. You drop the coin. It lands with a dull clink against the stone, but no one notices. Not the vendor, not the people passing. Caesar's face is everywhere, now stamped into every purse, slipped into every hand, tucked into every child's tooth jar, as a gift from the gods. They say Octavian issued it to honor his adoptive father, to remind Rome of its glory, to keep his memory alive. But you know better. It's not memory. It's conquest. A coin is power you can hold. And Caesar in death has become more permanent than any building, any law, any speech Brutus ever gave. You walk away from the stall, fast, then faster. Later that night, you sit at the edge of your cot, turning another one over in your palm. Where did it come from? A baker? A ferryman? A child? It doesn't matter. It always comes back. You try to scratch the face away, just a little, just to see if it bleeds. It doesn't. The metal bends, but he stays. Even in death, he's unkillable. His image stamped onto Rome itself, into every transaction, every trade, every beggar's bowl, every soldier's wage. You remember the moment you plunged the knife in. And now that same hand buys bread with the face of the man you killed. You think that maybe this is the real punishment. Not exile, not anonymity, but being surrounded by the proof that he won, that Rome didn't mourn him. It minted him. You begin to write. Not because anyone asked, not because anyone will read it, but because the silence has grown too loud and your mind needs a wall to press against. The scroll is old, the ink uneven. Your hand cramps more than it used to. You start with dates, the way all Roman histories do. You trace the years, the decrees, the signs. You talk about Caesar's ambitions, his disregard for tradition, his dangerous popularity. You list the powers he seized, the laws. He bent the customs he shattered. You quote Cato, then Cicero, then yourself. You try to be fair, but the longer you write, the more your words lean toward apology. You strike them out, rewrite, strike again. You describe the moment, the one under Pompey's statue, the curve of the blade, the blood, the heat of so many bodies closing in. You try to explain that it wasn't hatred, that it was fear, love for the Republic, a desperate act, not a selfish one. You pause. Even you don't believe it anymore. You try again, this time more emotional. You write about Rome as a mother, wounded, betrayed, that the knife was a bandage, that Caesar was a fever breaking. It sounds poetic, but not true. You burn that scroll. You write a new one, this time addressed to your children. You try to explain why their father became a shadow, why he gave up their names, why he let history erase him without protest. You write, "I did it for you," and immediately feel ashamed. You did it for ideas, for men long dead, for pride. You did it for Brutus. You did it because someone asked you to. You did it because it felt noble in the moment. You stop writing. The ink is dry. The scroll curls at the edges. No one will read it. You hide it under the floorboards beside the one letter you kept from Brutus, the one that only says, "We strike for Rome." Sometimes you think the only real truth you ever lived was the moment your knife entered flesh. Everything since has been footnotes. You tell yourself that someday someone might understand, that maybe in another century a scholar will find your words and see the clarity behind the blood. But part of you knows they won't. They'll remember Caesar. They'll remember the empire. But you'll be the villain in a line, a name in a footnote, or worse, a mistake. It happens quietly. No soldiers, no shouts, no final confession, just your breath slowing, then stopping. They find you days later, not in a temple or a battlefield, but in a rented room above a bakery. The kind of place that doesn't keep records, the kind of place where names don't matter. You left no note, no seal, no scroll on the table. Just a worn blanket, a flickering oil lamp, and the dull shine of one coin in your palm. Caesar's face turned downward. The neighbors don't ask questions. They tell the baker. He tells the priest. By the time any one official arrives, you're just another old man with a quiet past and no family name on record. They bury you outside the walls. No ceremony, no prayers in Latin. A boy places a stone to mark the spot, then walks away. And that's it. No monument, no statue, no line in marble declaring your virtue or your guilt. History doesn't record what you smelled in the Senate that morning, or how your hand shook, or how your eyes met Brutus's before the knife moved. There are no songs for you, no odes, no verses tucked into scrolls for noble readers. Only silence, and maybe that's fitting. Because you weren't the hero, you weren't the villain. You were just someone who believed once that a knife could save an idea. And now you're dust, like all the others, and Rome continues with new names, new gods, new faces on coins. The city doesn't remember you, but somewhere, in the breath between footsteps, on old marble, in the hush before a senator speaks, maybe there's still the faintest echo of what you did and what it cost. You never knew if he saw it all. Not then, not when you pushed open the heavy doors of the Curia, not when the blades rose like a tide, not when Caesar gasped, not when he fell. But he was there, hidden in the corner behind a marble pillar, eyes lowered, silent as he'd been trained to be. You only noticed him after, when the blood had cooled and the room had emptied and the echoes were too loud to ignore. He had a name, though no one used it. You remember his face now, more than the others. Not Brutus, not Cassius, Not even Caesar. It's the boy with the shaved head and worn sandals gripping the edge of the pillar so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. He didn't cry out, didn't run, didn't speak. He just watched, and he remembered. You know this because years later, long after your name was scrubbed from doorways, long after the Senate had become theater, someone mentioned him again. You were walking past the public baths in disguise when two men whispered, "That's the one." He served Caesar, saw it all. He had been sold, of course, after the funeral, transferred, quietly. That's what they did with the servants of the disgraced, even the powerful dead. Property becomes evidence. Evidence becomes threat. But he survived, and he spoke. You don't know how the stories got out, how his version of that day reached ears so far beyond Rome. But somewhere, between the heat of the kitchens and the shadows of slave quarters, he told the tale, over and over. Sometimes he said Caesar tried to speak Brutus's name. Sometimes he said he locked eyes with you. Once he claimed Caesar raised a trembling hand, not to shield, not to strike, but to forgive. It was a good story. Too good not to spread, and so it did. First in whispers, then in firelit retellings, then in scrolls, and somewhere, in that drift of detail and myth and longing, history changed. You became not the protector of the Republic, but the butcher of a god, and the boy. He became the last witness. You picture him now, older, slower, telling the same tale to curious boys at market stalls, to scribes who pay in olives, to soldiers who need something holy to believe in. You picture his hands drawing shapes in the dust, his voice low but steady. You don't hate him for it. You envy him. He lived. He remembered. And in remembering, he reshaped everything, not with a knife, not with a Senate vote, but with a single story, told often enough, believed deeply enough, to become the truth. She was never meant to be part of the story. She didn't wield a knife. She never stepped inside the Senate. She didn't whisper in corridors or swear loyalty beneath flickering lamps. But she read everything. She was the wife of a scribe, a quiet man who copied legal records and senatorial decrees in cramped, perfect lettering. He brought scrolls home to correct in the evenings, and she would sit beside the window with a lamp and trace every word with her eyes. She remembered better than he did, especially the names. Yours was one of them, not just in the rolls of senators, but in the private notes, in the drafts, in the letters never meant for history, the ones that carried fear in the margins, smudges of sweat in the corners, the ones written before the Ides of March, and especially after. When Caesar died, her husband changed, not in obvious ways, not the kind that break furniture or raise voices, but slowly, like ink fading in sun. He stopped correcting the scrolls. He stopped writing altogether, and one morning, without telling her, he packed the most sensitive ones, the ones Brutus had sent, the ones with secret lists, the ones bearing your name, into a sealed wooden box and buried it in the corner of their garden. Just until it's safe, he told her, but it never was. After Octavian rose, he started sleeping with a dagger beneath the bed. When the prescriptions began, he stopped sleeping altogether. Then one day, he didn't come home at all. She waited 2 days. On the third, someone slipped a copper ring into her window frame. His. She didn't cry. Instead, she dug up the box. She opened every scroll. Read them again, slowly. Let the weight of each word settle like dust in her chest. She lit a fire that night, not in anger, not in haste, just in certainty. One by one, she fed the scrolls into the flames. She didn't do it to protect the Republic, or to shield traitors. She did it because she understood what history does to names to men like you, and men like her husband, and women like her. It keeps the ones who shout loudest. It carves their faces into coins. It raises their statues, even if they lied. But the truth, the small truths, the whispers, they burn easily. She didn't save any of them. She could have. She could have hidden one, tucked it inside a wall, or sewn it into the lining of her robe. But she didn't, because she knew how stories grow when they're fed. And she was done feeding them. After the fire died, she sat beside the ashes and whispered each name again, not as an act of loyalty, but as a funeral. Yours was one of them. She was the last person to speak it aloud. You never met her, but she knew you. And now, no one does. He didn't know your name, but he knew Caesar's. He had marched under it, carved it into wood, shouted it into the dust before battle. He had bled for it twice. Once in Gaul, once in Hispania. Both times he came home with scars, and coin and stories that made children lean closer, and old men nod in silence. He wasn't political. He couldn't quote laws or trace senatorial bloodlines. He didn't know who Brutus was until the day Caesar died. Even then, it took a week before he understood Brutus wasn't just a name in an old poem. All he knew was the standard he carried, the eagle with Caesar's name beneath it. Not carved, not official, but scratched in by his own hand. A mark of loyalty, of memory. The day the news reached his camp, he didn't cry. Soldiers don't cry, not for men they follow, not out loud. But he sat for a long time, on the edge of his cot, the standard beside him, and didn't speak until the sun was gone. The officers were silent. Some celebrated, quietly, others locked their doors. When Antony's messengers came, the camp split, not in open rebellion, but in posture. The ones who followed Caesar kept their armor polished. The others kept their knives close. The soldier watched it unfold, not with hatred, not even grief, just disorientation. He had sworn an oath, not to the Senate, not to an idea, to a man, and that man had been carved apart in daylight. He didn't know what to do with that. So one night, after the fires had burned low and the dice had been packed away, he took the standard, the one he had carried for 7 years, and walked out beyond the camp walls. He found a patch of dry earth. He knelt, and he dug. The hole wasn't deep, just enough to hold the pole upright. He pressed the eagle in gently, wrapped the base with cloth, and packed the dirt back with bare hands. He didn't say a prayer. He didn't speak at all. But when he stood, something in his spine straightened. He walked back to the barracks, and when the others asked what he'd done, he said, "Buried the last order I ever trusted." They didn't argue. Some nodded. A few followed. Within weeks, 5 more standards vanished from camps across Italy. Quietly, without orders, just gone. Antony noticed. Octavian noticed more. Years later, during a ceremony in Rome, a new generation of recruits stood beneath bright silk banners and repeated oaths that meant nothing to them. A senator gave a speech. "Rome remembers," he said. "Rome endures." But not one of them knew about the soldier who knelt in the dust, pressing his loyalty into the ground like a body. Not one of them knew about the others who followed. Or that their silence was the last act of rebellion Rome ever feared. He was born after it all ended. Long after Caesar's ashes had cooled, long after Brutus became a footnote, long after your name disappeared from whispers and scrolls. He never saw the curia, never touched a real blade, but he knew the shape of a dagger. He drew them everywhere. On the walls, near the well, on the stones in the alley, on old clay pots with his finger in dust. Sometimes he gave them wings. Sometimes he drew them pierced through laurel wreaths. Once he drew one on a door, not in chalk, but with charcoal, and someone slapped him hard enough to leave a mark. He didn't understand why. To him, it was just a shape, something grown-ups talked about in half words, something the older boys dared each other to whisper, the ides, the stab, the kill. He'd heard it in songs. Children have songs for everything. One went like this. 1 for the wound, 2 for the crown, 3 for the ghost who never lay down. It didn't make sense, but children sang it while hopping between paving stones or while chasing each other with wooden sticks. Sometimes in games, one would shout, "I'm Caesar," and the others would cry, "Run," because no one wanted to be Caesar in the end. The boy didn't know why, not really. He asked his mother once. She hushed him and dropped a coin in a jar. When he asked again, she told him stories about tyrants and stars, and the gods who watch from above. But never about men, never about Rome, and never about the names. Still, he kept drawing. One day an old man stopped him, his back bent like a bow, his hands spotted and slow. He looked at the chalk dagger and said, "That's not how it looked." The boy tilted his head. "You saw one?" he asked. The old man didn't answer. He just reached into a satchel and pulled out a small bronze coin. The boy recognized the face, laurel profile, quiet eyes. "Who is he?" The old man smiled. "Everyone and no one." And then he walked on. The boy kept the coin. He stopped drawing daggers after that. Instead, he started drawing faces. Some with tears, some with knives, some with crowns that cracked in the middle. Years later, when he became a man, he carved one of those faces into the base of a fountain, hidden, small, behind the stone where water spilled. No one noticed. No one asked. But when the light hit it just right in the evening, it looked almost like a question. And maybe that's all the past ever becomes. Not a memory, not a warning, just a shape drawn in chalk, waiting to be misunderstood. You didn't expect to see him again. Not really, not like this. Not under painted lights on a wooden stage, wearing a robe too clean and a crown too bright. But there he was, Caesar, stepping into the center of a marketplace-turned theater with the weight of 1,000 eyes resting on his shoulders. The actor playing him was too young, too tall, too sure, but the crowd didn't care. They gasped when he entered. They leaned in. Children fell silent. And when he spoke, when that voice echoed through the narrow stone square, something old in your body stirred. He was quoting lines Caesar never said, lines that made him sound more like a poet than a soldier, more like a god than a man. "I gave Rome its heartbeat. I bled for peace, not power. Even the knife knew my name." You watched from the back hood, up unmoving. The crowd knew what came next. The ides, the betrayal, the blades. It was all staged with oil lamps and red cloth and overacted gasps. The actor fell slowly, gracefully. He died in silence, arms, outstretched eyes, toward the gods. You remember something else. You remember Caesar, choking, fighting for breath? His knees failing, his hand grasping at Brutus's robe, not with poetry, but with disbelief. The audience stood, applauded. Some wept. After the play, you wandered toward the back, near the actor's tent. You told yourself you were just passing, but your feet had their own ideas. He stepped out as you approached the actor, still wearing half the costume, the crown tilted slightly on his sweat-damp hair. You said nothing at first. He noticed your stare. "You saw the show?" he asked. You nodded. He smiled. "People love him, even now." "Why do you think that is?" you asked. He shrugged. "He died beautifully." You wanted to say no. You wanted to say it wasn't beautiful, that it was messy, brutal, that he was betrayed by men who'd once sworn loyalty in the very room they killed him. That the blood took hours to clean, that the silence afterward was worse than any scream. But instead you asked, "Do you think he deserved it?" The actor paused, then said, "Does it matter?" You turned before he could ask your name. As you walked away, the applause still rang in your ears, louder than the screams ever were, louder than Caesar's voice, louder than your own. And you realized with a chill that reached deeper than any dagger, the role lives longer than the man. He didn't mean to find it. The earth was hard, that morning, clay and root-bound. He cursed the frost, the shovel, the man who hadn't paid for a proper tomb. It wasn't a noble burial, just another shallow grave hastily assigned on the city's edge. He was paid in bread and wine, not enough for the cold. But when the shovel struck metal, it didn't sound like a coin. It rang with a different pitch, softer, older. He knelt, brushing dirt aside with calloused hands. There, it was a ring, heavy, still gleaming beneath the soil. No stone, no inscription on the outside. Just a small carved laurel feint, worn nearly flat. On the inside, 3 letters barely visible, SPQ. He didn't know what they meant. He slipped it on his thumb. It fit too tightly, but he didn't care. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. He showed it to no one. Not the sexton, not the merchant who came to collect the ashes, not even his wife. He kept it wrapped in cloth and hidden in his boot. Some nights, he took it out and stared at it by firelight, wondered whose hand it once circled. A senator, a soldier, a traitor. He made up stories. In one, it had belonged to a man who stood beside Caesar the day he died. In another, it was dropped by someone fleeing the city during the proscriptions. Sometimes he thought it was cursed that it had been buried for a reason. Still, he never gave it up. Years passed. The ring dulled. One night, he wandered into the wine quarter and drank more than he should. He bragged about the ring to a group of younger men, actors, students, loud voices, and empty purses. They asked to see it. He said no. When he left, they followed. No one found his body, just his satchel, empty. And weeks later, the ring appeared on the finger of a senator's son, polished recut, now set with a garnet. He said it was a family heirloom, that it had always belonged to men of honor. No one questioned him. And the gravedigger, no one spoke his name again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind cuts sharp and the earth freezes over, someone passing by the northern wall might hear a whisper below the stone. It didn't belong to you. He was respected in the way only historians can be, old, meticulous, with scrolls piled to the ceiling and ink-stained fingers that trembled not from age but from certainty. He'd never fought in a war, never stepped into the forum on a day of blood, never smelled ash on a toga or heard the rattle of sandals just before a man turned to run. But he wrote like he had. He gathered sources, letters, testimonials, Senate records, though most had been scrubbed clean. He claimed objectivity like a priest claims purity. His quill moved with rhythm, sharp and sure. And when he wrote about the Ides of March, the ink flowed faster. To him, it was tragedy wrapped in logic, fate disguised as politics. He wrote that Brutus struck first. He wrote that Caesar forgave him with his eyes. He wrote that your name was likely invented. He reduced the day to a pattern. He removed the silence in the room, the sweat, the panic, the stutter of men who had never killed before, the blur of movement that wasn't noble or strategic, just desperate. You read it years later. In a copy smuggled west, your hands shook, not with anger, not even grief, but recognition, not of truth, but of power, because this was the final knife, not steel, not bronze, but narrative. He had taken your story and erased you from it, not out of malice, not vengeance, just footnoted irrelevance. There were only so many names he could include, only so much space on the page. He favored those whose statues still stood, whose descendants still paid scribes, whose coins still passed through temples. You were not one of them. And so he wrote, it is likely there were fewer conspirators than originally claimed. Some names were added by rumor, others by cowardice. History has kept the true ones. He never imagined one of them might still be alive, reading. He never considered that you might remember what the floor smelled like when Caesar fell, that you still heard the sound of his ring skidding across marble. He never asked if any of it hurt, because his version didn't need pain, only symmetry. Later, his students would recite his account as gospel, teachers would copy it, playwrights would polish it, artists would draw scenes from it, statues would rise not of what was, but of what fit the story best. And you were gone. You realized then that death doesn't erase you. History does. And sometimes the man holding the pen is more dangerous than the one holding the blade. It always begins the same way. You are standing beneath a skylight. The marble is cool beneath your sandals. The air smells of dust and lamp oil. Voices murmur in Latin. The hem of your toga brushes your shin. You are sweating, but you don't feel warm. Caesar enters. His steps are slow, deliberate, softer than they should be. You try to look at his face, but the light strikes him wrong. He's always in half shadow. You can't see his expression, only the movement of his laurel crown. You know what's coming. Your hand is already on the blade. But something's different this time. The floor pattern shifts. The senators are out of order. Brutus isn't where he should be. Cassius is silent. You hear your own breathing. The first strike doesn't land. Caesar turns. He looks at you, and for the first time in all the nights this dream has returned, he speaks. Why are you still here? You try to answer, but your mouth doesn't open. Your feet don't move. You're trapped, not by fear, but by repetition. Because this isn't memory anymore. This is ritual. You relive it because you haven't learned how to stop. Because the moment holds more power than the years that followed. Because it's the one place where you still exist. You are never awake in this dream, but you are never quite asleep either. Sometimes you try to leave. You push open the doors of the Curia, step into a street that bends the wrong way. The buildings are wrong. The faces are blurred. The sky is low. Other times, you never reach Caesar. You wake just as your blade lifts. Your hand burns. Your lungs are empty. And once, only once, you drop the knife. It clattered to the floor like a coin. Caesar looked down at it. Then up at you, and said nothing. That was the worst night, because you realized the dream wasn't punishing you. It was keeping you. You have no grave, no monument, no lineage, no legend. But here, in this endless marble chamber, inside the same second stretched across eternity, you are alive. And you are guilty, and you are remembered. Only here, only now. Only in the dream. You never saw his face. Not during the war, not during the purges, not when names were posted and throats were slit before the sun could rise. But you saw his work. Everyone did. It began with a list. He didn't write it. That wasn't his job. His job was to make it shorter. At first, he flinched. The first man begged, the second cursed, the third spat, but the fourth just looked at him and nodded. That was the one that broke something. After that, it was easier. He stopped remembering names. They were just sounds, syllables that trembled through his ears and vanished. He focused on the motions, the grip, the angle, the cleanup. You could train your body to do anything, he realized. Even this. He was never cruel. He didn't draw it out. He didn't joke. He didn't enjoy it. But he never said no. Sometimes he wondered if he had once been a good man. Maybe he'd had a dog, a son, a wife with long fingers and a soft laugh. He couldn't remember. His past had blurred like old ink in the rain. The city fed him, paid him, feared him, but rarely spoke to him, until one day the name on the paper stopped him cold. Yours. He recognized it, not from a speech, not from a courtroom, but from a dream he once had years ago, before all of this began. A dream of a man standing beneath the skylight, shaking, saying nothing. He didn't know why he remembered, just that he did. He didn't ask questions. That wasn't allowed. He went to the address. A plain room, barely a home. You were already waiting, your hands folded, your eyes not defiant, just tired. You said one thing. Do you know why? He opened his mouth and realized he didn't. The laws had shifted too many times. The sides had blurred. The reasons were thin as smoke. All that remained was the routine. He stepped back. And you said, it's all right. You reached for his blade. He let you. You turned it in your own hand. And when he walked away, he left the list behind. No one asked him why. No one missed your name. No one rewrote the paper. And by the time he reached the alley, he had already forgotten the number. But for a moment, just one breath, he had remembered you. And that was almost enough. She never asked you to choose. Not between her and the cause, not between the Republic and your home, but she saw the shift in your eyes long before your hand ever touched a dagger. You stopped looking at her during dinner. You started quoting Cicero again. You rose earlier, returned later, and when she asked what was troubling you, you answered with phrases that weren't really yours. The Republic is in danger. Caesar threatens the old order. There are conversations happening. She knew the tone, knew the distance. She had seen it in others before. In men preparing to do something irreversible. In men convincing themselves they were right. She said nothing. She stayed. Until the day you didn't come home. She waited. Not for hours, for days, then weeks. The servants whispered. The neighbors stopped calling. The bread man avoided her eyes. Eventually, someone told her. They said your name softly, like a curse being smothered. He was part of it. They say he struck too. She didn't weep. She walked to your writing desk and opened the bottom drawer. The mask was there, plain wooden, featureless. The one you wore to meetings in the back rooms of the Curia. The one you once held in shaking hands before slipping it over your face like armor. You thought she didn't know. She always knew. She took it in both hands and carried it to the garden. The soil was soft. She dug slowly, careful not to crack it. She placed it beneath the olive tree you once planted together, the one that hadn't borne fruit in years. She said nothing, but before covering it, she did one thing. She kissed it, not as a symbol, as a part of you. That night, she lit a single candle, sat in silence, and began to write. Not a letter, not a testimony. Just memory. She wrote about the way you used to hum while tying your sandals, the way your fingers curled when you read something too quickly, the way you once cried when you found a broken bird in the garden and buried it with your own hands. She did not write about Caesar. She did not write about Rome. Because she knew the world would do that for her badly. What she needed to preserve was the man before the history. And then, when her ink dried, she folded the parchment, sealed it with wax, and tucked it behind a loose stone in the hearth, not to be found. Not to be read. Just not forgotten. He didn't mean to erase you. He wasn't a censor or a politician or a historian with an agenda. He was a librarian, a man of quiet habits, ink-stained cuffs, and a soft fondness for scrolls that crackled when unrolled. His job wasn't to judge, only to sort, to preserve, to categorize. But in Rome, even preservation can become an act of politics. It happened on an unremarkable morning. The sun was flat, the dust heavier than usual. A scroll had been returned by a junior scribe, a half-burnt copy of The Deed at the Curia. Badly copied, too poetic in parts, but still readable. He opened it, read the names, Brutus, Cassius Cinna, and yours. The passage about you was vague, just a line. He struck in silence, and when it was done, he left no words behind. The librarian paused. The scroll had no citation. The author was anonymous, and worse, the tone leaned toward allegory, the sort of flourishes that made Roman officials uncomfortable. Rome loved power, not poetry. Not anymore. He sighed. There were 3 shelves available, one for biography, one for political documents, and one, the tall one at the back, near the crack in the marble wall, labeled simply, Myth. He hesitated, then walked to the 3rd. He slid the scroll in between the fire speakers of Alba Longa and the dream prophets of Tiber's shore, somewhere between legend and exaggeration. He didn't smile, didn't feel triumphant. It wasn't even a decision. It was convenience. But something shifted as he turned away. A thought he wouldn't let himself finish. What if that was the last copy? What if by placing that scroll on that shelf, he'd just tilted the future? Weeks passed. A student came looking for material on the Republic's fall. The librarian guided her to Cicero. Sallust? Plutarch. She asked about the Ides. He gave her 3 names, the approved ones. She never found your story. Years passed. Mildew crept along the wall near the myth section. Scrolls were moved. The less read. Ones were boxed, stored, forgotten. One day the librarian retired. No one asked what he'd shelved. No one checked the boxes. No one read your name again. Not because it was untrue, but because truth requires placement. And you had been filed out of relevance. It stood at the edge of the square. Not in the center where gods and emperors towered above the crowd. Not beside the temple where pigeons nested on the shoulders of marble heroes. But near the fountain, half-shadowed, half-forgotten, where rain pooled and children kicked pebbles. The statue had no name. No inscription, just a robed figure, arms folded, gaze lowered, or what was left of a gaze. Time had worn the face smooth. The mouth was gone. The eyes had caved. Only the folds of the toga remained distinct, one edge chipped as if something had struck it once long ago. No one knew who it was meant to be. Some said a minor senator, others a failed general. A few whispered it was a placeholder, a monument built before history could decide if the man deserved to be remembered. But no name had ever been carved. You saw it once by accident. You had returned to Rome in secret, years after everyone thought you dead. Your beard was longer, your back more bent, but your feet remembered the alleys. You kept to the edges. You watched. And then you turned a corner. And froze. The statue was small, unassuming, but something in it stopped your breath. The curve of the shoulders, the way the weight leaned subtly to the left, the faint pattern on the robe's hem, a pattern your wife once embroidered into the lining of your cloak. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be, but it was. You stepped closer, touched the base, cold, rough, still no name. Who had ordered it? When? Why? Who remembered enough to carve the folds of your robe, but not the line of your face? You circled it. No offerings lay at its feet. No garlands, no coins, just wind and dust and the hiss of the nearby fountain. You sat across from it until dusk. And in that fading light, you began to wonder, was it ever really meant to be you? Or had you simply projected yourself into the shape, like water poured into a vessel? Maybe the sculptor had chosen you, not your story, but your silence, your absence, your lack of a voice. Maybe the blank face wasn't a flaw. Maybe it was the truth. You stood slowly. Someone passed behind you and glanced up. Who's that? They asked, not to you, just aloud. Their friend shrugged. Nobody. And they walked on. You did too. You never returned. But sometimes, when the wind is sharp and the air smells like stone, someone passing the statue pauses, looks up, shivers, not because they recognize it, but because something in it recognizes them. He wasn't a senator. He wasn't a conspirator. He didn't hold a knife. He held a key. It was heavy, bronze cold, even in sunlight, with teeth worn from decades of turning the same lock. He wore it on a leather thong around his neck, tucked beneath his tunic, even when he bathed, especially then. He was the curious door warden, not a title carved in stone, not a name spoken at games, just the man who opened the doors at sunrise, swept the entryway, and locked it again when the business of the Republic was done. He didn't speak much, didn't need to. His orders were clear: no entry without permission, no lingering after dusk, and above all, no opinion. He had kept those rules his entire life. Until that day. He remembers the morning clearly because it was wrong. Too many men had arrived early. Their sandals echoed too loudly. Their greetings were too brief. They passed one another without nods. Some avoided eye contact altogether. The curia smelled not of oil and chalk and dust, but of sweat, anxiety, a copper edge in the air. He opened the doors, as he always did. He did not look behind him. That was his mistake. He stepped outside, as instructed, waited by the pillars, counted birds, listened to the clink of coins from the market below. Then the screams. Only once a sharp cry that turned into silence. Then feet. Running, staggering, sandals slipping on stone. He stepped back just in time for 3 men to rush past him, pale, wide-eyed blood staining the hems of their robes. He turned and saw the floor. And Caesar, and the knives still clutched in hands that had no idea how to let go. No one gave him orders, but he knew what to do. He stepped inside, closed the doors, turned the key. It clicked louder than it ever had before. Then he sat down on the steps and waited. For an hour. Then 2. No one approached him. No one asked what had happened inside. The key burned against his chest. Eventually, someone came, an officer from the guard, his voice brittle. "You may go," he said. The doorman nodded. He stood. He didn't go home. He walked to the Tiber and stood by the water until night came. He didn't weep. He didn't pray. He simply stood still. The next morning he returned to the Curia. The doors were still shut. No one asked him to open them. And he never did again. Years passed. He was given a new post outside a grain depot. Safe, simple, impersonal. No one asked about that day. No one mentioned the key. But he still wore it. Not as a badge, as a weight. And when he died, quietly alone, in a rented room, the undertaker found the key beneath his shirt. They didn't know what it unlocked. So they melted it down, poured the bronze into a mold for a coin that bore Octavian's face. And just like that, the last man who closed the Republic's door helped open something else. He was chasing a lizard. That's how it began. The sun was high, and the stones around the old Curia were warm to the touch. The building was closed now, sealed since long before he was born, its doors overgrown with ivy, its windows dusted with spiderwebs instead of curtains. To him, it wasn't sacred. It was a place to play. He darted along the side wall, leapt over a crack where grass grew stubborn through marble. The lizard slipped under a collapsed column. He crouched, reached blindly, and touched metal. Not cold, not gold, but green with age, thin, brittle. He pulled it out slowly. A laurel wreath. Its shape still held, though some leaves had crumbled. It was delicate, far too delicate for a child's hands, but he didn't know that. To him, it was treasure, a crown. He stood up and placed it on his head, and smiled. That afternoon, he ran through the streets with it, declaring himself Caesar, Consul King. He didn't know the difference. His friends laughed, chased him, tried to knock it off. "No," he cried. "It's mine, I found it. I'm ruler now." An old man passing by stopped in his tracks. He watched the boy. Watched the green circlet bob and tilt with every step. His eyes went wide. He remembered. He remembered that wreath. He remembered the statue it sat beneath. He remembered the day they carried the real one out of the Curia, still wet with Caesar's blood. He reached out to the boy. "Where did you—" But the child was already gone laughing into an alley. By sunset, the wreath was bent. By morning it was gone, tossed into a ditch, when a corner tore and the game ended. Another toy broken. Another piece of the past returned to dust. No one mourned it. No one traced its origin, but the old man never forgot. Sometimes, years later, he would walk past that same alley, and pause, and picture the boy, not for what he said, but for what he didn't know. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't hatred, it's forgetfulness. The kind that dances with sacred objects and laughs in the ruins of things that once decided the fate of the world. He had a voice like polished wood. Deep, measured, heavy with years and reputation. When he stood to speak in the Senate, men listened, not because they feared him, but because his words had a way of settling into the bones. He could quiet a chamber with a single phrase. until the day he said nothing. He was there, inside the curia, 2 rows back, close enough to see the blade flash, far enough not to be splashed. You remember his eyes. They didn't widen, they didn't close, they just watched. He didn't run when Caesar fell. He didn't shout. He didn't tremble. He just sat there, motionless, as the life drained from the Republic onto the floor. Later, when the others had fled, or been pulled out weeping or vomiting, he rose, straightened his robes, walked to the door. The guards let him pass. He said nothing. At first, people assumed it was shock, a momentary affliction, understandable, treatable. But days passed, then weeks, then months. And still nothing. He attended meetings, sat in the same marble chair, listened, voted when pressed, raised his hand when required. But never once did he speak. No more speeches, no more corrections, no more warnings. He became a quiet pillar in the Senate, a monument to a moment no one wanted to relive. Some admired him, called it dignified. Others mocked him, called it cowardice. But no one truly knew. You did. Because once, long after the daggers had dulled, and Caesar's face was carved into every coin you passed him in the garden of statues, he was standing alone. You stopped. He looked at you, not with recognition, but with something heavier. He raised one hand, pressed 2 fingers to his lips, then placed them gently on the plinth of an unmarked statue. It wasn't Caesar's. It wasn't yours. It was just blank. Then he walked away. You never saw him again. Years later, they carved his name into a stone near the Senate wall, not for what he said, but for the silence he kept. And somewhere, deep in that silence, lay the only honest record of what happened that day. She wasn't a senator's wife. She wasn't a widow of war. She didn't know you or Brutus or Caesar. She sold bread. Flat, simple loaves baked over coals behind a cracked window in the Subura. Her hands were rough. Her apron always dusted with flour. She never read Cicero. She never quoted law. She knew the weight of coin better than the weight of words. But she lived through that day. March 15th. The sky had been gray, the pigeons loud, the city too quiet. She remembered thinking something is about to break. She was 17, pregnant alone. The father gone, a soldier or a thief or both. She stopped waiting for him when the winter came. And then, on that strange, heavy morning, just as the city began to stir from its haunted silence, she went into labor. The women helped. The midwife came late. The floor was cold, her breath shallow. But the child arrived just as the bells from the forum began to ring, not in celebration, not in ritual, but in chaos. She didn't know Caesar was dead. Not yet. She only knew the world had changed. She held the boy to her chest, and when the midwife asked for a name, she said, "Ides." The woman blinked. "That's not a name." "It is now," she whispered. People told her to change it. Friends, priests, neighbors. "It's unlucky," they said. "It's cursed." But she refused. She didn't name him after Caesar. She named him after the day the city cracked, the day power bled, the day fear walked openly. She wanted him to carry it, to remind people. She didn't want him to grow up believing statues, or coins, or lies. So when he could walk, she took him past the curia, still sealed, still silent. She pointed to the doors and said that's where the world turned upside down. When he could speak, she taught him the words no one said anymore: republic, conspirator, forgiveness. She baked bread. He ran errands. They lived simply. But the name lingered. He grew into it tall, quiet, watchful. Teachers stumbled when they read the roll. Ides, they asked. Of what? He would smile. Of everything. As he grew, rumors followed. Some said he was born cursed. Others whispered that his mother had once known a man on the list. A few believed he was Caesar's son, hidden in plain sight. None of it was true, except the name. That part mattered. Because years later, long after his mother passed, long after the wreaths dried on her door, I'd stood in the forum rebuilt, now repaved, renamed. And a child asked him, "What does your name mean?" And he said, "A memory," then turned and walked away. It was just a wall. Unmarked, unadorned. No carving of gods, no bust embedded in stone. Just rough-cut limestone blocks stacked in the old way, dry and solid pale when the sun hit them, and gold at dusk. No one looked at it. Not anymore. It stood behind the curia, near the alley where the servants used to wait, where the messengers came and went unnoticed, where the blood was washed away before the public could see too much. But the wall saw everything. It saw you walk in that day. It heard the whispers before the doors closed. It felt the weight of men pressed against its back breath, held palms sweaty, the air thick with doubt. And after the moment, after the blades, after Caesar fell, the wall felt the slap of someone's hand flat against its face, a hand smeared with blood. Whether it was yours or Brutus's or someone else's, it never mattered. The mark was there. A streak, a palm print, a memory. You forgot it. Rome forgot it, but the wall didn't. Stone remembers in ways people can't. Seasons passed. The stain faded, but every time the rain hit it, just right, the shape would darken for a few minutes, as if the past were breathing through pores that couldn't close. Moss grew in the cracks. Ivy climbed and curled and withered. The bricks shifted, settled, aged. 100 years later, a boy scraped his initials into it with a nail. He paused halfway through, felt something in the surface that pushed back. He never finished. Another century. A woman sat beneath it to eat her lunch. She leaned against the stone and shivered, though it was summer. She never sat there again. And once, just once, a mason tried to tear it down, to build something new. He struck it with a hammer. The head snapped off the handle. He cursed. Picked up a chisel, tried again. The chisel bounced. He didn't try a third time. He built around it. Now it stands between buildings, a corner no one sweeps, a spot where pigeons roost and dust collects. But sometimes on the anniversary, someone walks by, someone who doesn't know the whole story. They pause, touch the stone, feel the chill, and step back. Not because they know, but because something does. And in that pause, that flicker of recognition without understanding, the wall remembers. They told you to throw it in. The knife, the one you used, or maybe just the one you held long enough to cut long enough to matter. It didn't matter whose it was by then. No one wanted the blade to exist anymore. Cassius whispered the instruction. Brutus avoided your eyes. The Tiber takes all things, someone said. Let it take this. So that night, wrapped in cloth and tied with cord, you walked to the river bank. The moon was high. The stones were slick. The water moved like a slow breath across the city's ribs. You stood in silence for a long time. Then you threw. The cloth sliced through air. The splash was quiet, and for a second you felt lighter. You turned to leave, but the next morning it was there. On the shore, unwrapped, still wet. You blinked, thought it must be a different knife, a coincidence. Rome was full of blades. You picked it up. It was yours. You didn't tell anyone. You walked farther upstream that night, waited until no one could see, bound it tighter, weighted it with stone, whispered something, not a prayer, not a curse, and cast it deeper. It sank. The current caught it. Gone. 2 days later, a fisherman found it snagged in his net. The stone still tied, the blade still clean, no rust. He sold it to a collector who liked strange objects with no story. Decades passed. It reappeared in a drawer, then a vault, then a merchant's stall. People picked it up and set it down uneasy. No one bought it. The blade never dulled, but it never seemed to belong. Eventually, It disappeared again. Some say the river took it back. Some say it was never really in the river to begin with. Because water remembers, not the names, not the reasons, but the weight. And maybe, just maybe, some things can't be washed away. Not by time. Not by politics. Not by Rome. So now the story goes, if you walk along the Tiber alone at dawn, and the fog is thick, and you listen carefully, you might hear a splash, not a fish, not a bird, but something heavier, something returning. Again, you didn't even notice it fall. Not at first, your hands were shaking, not from guilt, not yet, but from the adrenaline that still surged through you, like wine poured too fast. The chamber smelled of sweat and old marble. Caesar lay behind you, his robes already soaking through, and you were gripping the handle of your dagger so tightly, your fingers ached. That's when it happened. A small red shape, barely visible, slipped from the folds of your toga and hit the floor with a muffled click. Your personal seal. Nothing grand, just a carved piece of bone in a brass setting. Your initials etched beside a fading family crest. You carried it everywhere to stamp letters, seal agreements, leave marks where your voice couldn't go. Now it lay in the blood forgotten. You didn't pick it up. You told yourself it didn't matter. But days later, when the chamber was finally cleaned, a servant found it, young, barefoot. She didn't know what it was, but she tucked it into her apron. Thought it might be worth something. A trinket, a lucky charm, a game piece. She showed it to her brother that night. He recognized the crest, and his eyes went wide. That boy, barely 12, had helped his uncle copy names for the tax rolls. He knew your name, had inked it dozens of times. He whispered, this belonged to someone important. They didn't take it to the guard, or the priests, or the Senate. They took it to a merchant. The merchant took it to a moneylender. The moneylender took it to a minor noble who owed him favors. Within 2 days, it sat on the desk of a man in Antony's inner circle. He turned it over in his palm. He smiled. And that was the beginning. Your name, once hidden in shadow, resurfaced not because someone remembered, but because your hand had dropped what it once held so carefully. You'd tried so hard to disappear, to silence yourself in the records, to scrub away every letter. But this one small object undid everything. They added your name to the list. Not because of ideology, because of evidence. Because of a seal the size of a coin. And so you learned something too late. History is not made by great speeches or marble tombs. It's made by what you drop when you think no one is watching. She wasn't meant to be there. She was just a servant, borrowed from a noble house for the day sent to dust the upper alcoves of the Curia. No one thought twice about her. No one even remembered her name. But she remembered everything. She was sweeping near the back, when the senators entered earlier than usual, too quiet. She'd learned to notice things like that. The way men walked when something was about to break. The way silence felt heavier when words were about to be betrayed. She ducked behind the curtain, out of instinct, not fear. And from there, through the thin slit in the fabric, she watched it all. She saw Caesar enter, heard the scrape of his sandals, the way his voice echoed, like it always did, strong, certain, unaware. She saw the circle tighten, the first movement, the glint of metal. Then the frenzy. She didn't scream, didn't flinch, just watched. Frozen, the curtain pressed against her face as men lunged, as cloth tore, as blood hit the floor with a sick slap that would echo in her ears for years. One of the blades clattered just a foot from where she stood, dropped by a trembling hand that would later deny it had ever held one. She didn't move until long after the room emptied. Even then, her legs barely responded. She never told anyone, not because she feared retribution, though she did, but because she knew the truth wouldn't help. Who would believe her? A woman, a servant, no name, no records? She would become rumor, or worse, erased, so she stayed silent. but she saw their faces. She remembered how Brutus looked after it was done, how your hand shook, how one man wept openly before wiping his face with Caesar's robe. She saw everything, and from that day forward, nothing in Rome felt clean. She quit the Curia, returned to the kitchens, refused to enter any building with marble floors, refused to look senators in the eye. When her mistress asked why she jumped at sharp noises, she lied. When she had children, she told them stories not of glory, but of blood, not of heroes, but of hands that couldn't stop shaking. She never said she'd seen it, but the stories were too detailed. Her daughter once asked, "How do you know all this?" She said, "I was nearby." That was true, near enough to watch history crack, too far to stop it, and close enough that it never let her go. You heard it in the marketplace first. A boy with a reed flute tapping rhythm on a clay jar, his voice soft but clear over the buzz of morning trade. The tune was familiar. Ancient, even the old march sung at Caesar's triumphs. You had heard it 100 times before. But the words, they were different. Not wrong, just shifted. Where it once said, "He brings the grain," the boy sang, "He takes the breath." Where it praised the laurel's light, he now sang the shadow under stone. You froze. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. The boy wasn't performing for nobles. He sang for coin, for distraction, for fun. You approached him later, quietly. "Where did you learn that version?" you asked. He shrugged. "My father sang it." "And where did he learn it?" Another shrug. "Everyone knows it." But you knew they didn't. Because the original version, the real version, had been buried under official decrees, stamped onto marble, blasted by horns at festivals. No one questioned it. No one dared. Except someone had. Somewhere, someone had taken the anthem and twisted it. Not with anger, not with fire, but with something more dangerous rhythm. The kind of change that doesn't confront. It seeps. You followed whispers, found the man weeks later in a tavern near the edge of the city, old sharp-eyed hands more suited to plucking strings than lifting swords. He didn't deny it. "I rewrote it," he said. Why? "Because they forgot who bled," he said, "and who smiled while they bled." You stared at him. You knew Caesar. "No," he said, "but I knew people who died because they didn't cheer loud enough." He strummed his lute once. The notes hung between you like judgment. "They wanted songs," he said. "I gave them songs, just slightly off-key." He smiled a sad smile. "It takes longer," he said, "but songs never stay where you put them." You nodded. You didn't tell him who you were. Didn't tell him that you once walked beside the man he now sang in shadow. That your blade had tasted the moment he now turned into chorus. You just listened, and when he finished, you dropped a coin in his bowl. It bore Caesar's face, but that night the streets echoed with another voice. Yours, maybe. Or maybe just the voice of someone who remembered what your voice had once tried to do. It should have been repaired. After the blood dried, after the statues were scrubbed, after the speeches were made, and the crowds dispersed, and the coins were minted, someone should have fixed the door, but no one did. The Curia's main door, the same one Caesar passed through on the morning he died, had splintered at the edge. A crack small at first grew worse each time it was pushed open, not from violence, just from time. After the assassination, a new guard was stationed there. He reported it. "The lock doesn't hold. The bolt is loose." He was told, "Leave it. The Senate isn't using that chamber for a while." When the Senate returned, someone mentioned it again. "Should we fix the door?" No one responded, and so it remained. You passed by it once under cloak and shadow. You hadn't planned to stop. It was too close to the memory, too close to the last time your name meant something. But something made you pause. You walked to the door, placed your hand on the wood. It still bore faint traces, not blood, not really, but scarring, scratches, a faded smear that had soaked too deep into the grain to ever fully disappear. The lock hung loosely. It clicked if you touched it, but didn't catch. You leaned your weight against it. It opened, just slightly. The room beyond was dark, empty. You didn't step inside. You closed the door softly and walked away. Later, you learned others had passed by two young men with ideas, old men with guilt. A woman once left a sprig of laurel beneath the hinge. A child carved a dagger shape near the bottom. And still, no one fixed it. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe it was a statement. Or maybe deep down, Rome wanted that door to stay vulnerable, as if repairing it would mean pretending the wound had healed. So year after year the door stood, unlocked, unchanged, not a monument, not a ruin. Just ajar, a reminder that once in that space, something ended. And no matter how many names were erased, that crack remained. He wasn't supposed to read it. It came to the monastery with a batch of old scrolls, legal records, trade inventories, scribbled notes from forgotten clerks. Monks were taught to catalog, not question. Copy, not interpret. But that day, curiosity whispered louder than obedience. He unrolled it. The parchment crackled. The ink had faded, but the list was still legible, 23 names carefully numbered, each marked with a tiny X or a short line of Latin that chilled his spine. Held the knife, blocked the door, confirmed the hour. He didn't recognize all of them. Some had long since been erased from public memory, but one yours stopped him. It wasn't just the name. It was the note beside it, struck once, looked away. He read it again, and again. The words weren't angry, they weren't reverent, just observant, cold, precise. He didn't sleep that night. In the morning, he took the list to his superior. The abbot glanced at it once, then folded it quickly. "We don't need this," he said. "Burn it." But the monk hesitated. He wasn't a rebel, he wasn't a liar. But he was a reader, and something in those names, in their order, their silence felt truer than the polished stories carved into temple walls. So he didn't burn it. That night, by candlelight, he wrapped the scroll in oilcloth, slipped it beneath his robe, and walked to the chapel's base. Behind the altar where the stone had cracked in an earthquake decades earlier, he pried open a gap just wide enough. He placed the list inside and sealed it with wax. He didn't write about it. He didn't speak of it, but he remembered. Every time he passed the altar, every time he sang the liturgy, every time history was praised as clean, he knew better. Because the list still existed, not in books, not in scrolls, but in one hidden space where parchment met dust and names waited like breath held too long. Years later, on his deathbed, someone asked if he had any last confessions. He smiled. "There's a list," he said. But by the time they asked where, he was already gone. They swore it was superstition. Stone doesn't echo unless it's shaped right. Marble chambers amplify the wrong tones. Sounds cling longer in corners. All of that made sense to architects, to priests, to anyone trying to explain away what people whispered about the Curia. But you knew better. Because you had heard it. That morning, when Caesar fell, before the blood reached your sandals, before the silence strangled the room, there had been a sound. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a word. It was something in between. Not language, not panic, just rupture. A sound made not by a man, but by the moment itself. It vibrated in the floor. It rattled the glass in the upper windows. It curved into the breath of everyone who stood too still to speak. And then it was gone. But not really. Because weeks later, when they reopened the Curia for business as usual, someone paused at the threshold. A senator, not involved in the act, not even in the city that day. He stepped inside and froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked. No one answered, but more noticed. Servants began refusing to sweep the corners of the chamber. Guards stood farther from the door than their post required. A young orator once dropped his scroll mid-speech, then claimed he heard someone whisper his name behind him, even though he was alone. The echo had no form, no pattern, just presence. You returned only once, not to speak, not to visit, just to stand in the shadow of the place where Caesar died. The room had been cleaned, repaired, lit by new torches. But the sound was still there. Not constant, not even audible, but felt, like pressure behind the ears, like a memory refusing to dissolve. You stood in the spot where your feet had once slipped, where your dagger had trembled, where your breath had caught, and in that stillness you heard it again. Faint, familiar. The same tone, not a scream, not a voice, just consequence. You stepped back. The room didn't chase you. It didn't need to, because that echo, that strange, shape-shifting hum of history collapsing in on itself. It never left the chamber. It just waits for silence. It was just a table, heavy oak darkened by age and oil, 4 sturdy legs, a broad flat top burnished by the elbows of men who believed their words could shape empires. It stood at the front of the curia, beneath the skylight, beside the statue of Roma Victa. You remember it well. You sat at it once, signed scrolls on it, passed jugs of wine across it, argued over border disputes and taxation quotas and the right age to enter the priesthood. It was never meant for violence, but that day, it caught everything. When Caesar stumbled, his hand knocked it. One scroll rolled off the edge, landing in a puddle. Another soaked up blood through the fibers, a decree on land reform ink still drying. And when he finally collapsed, his shoulder hit the leg. It creaked, groaned, tilted, but didn't fall. Like it knew. When they came to clean the chamber, they didn't move the table. No one dared touch it. When the new magistrate arrived weeks later and tried to convene a session, he walked to the table and stopped. He set his scroll down. It curled. He reached for his stylus and hesitated, then turned. They met instead on the steps. After that, all meetings were held elsewhere. In courtyards, in gardens, in rented halls, anywhere but beside that table. It stood untouched for years. Eventually dust gathered. The wood warped slightly. Someone carved a name into the underside, not Caesar's, just a girl's name, maybe a servant's first love. The table stayed. People stepped around it like a grave. Once a junior senator leaned against it while delivering a report. His voice cracked. He sat down mid-sentence. No one asked why. Finally, they moved it to a storeroom. Covered it with linen. Wrote archive unusable on the tag. But it wasn't broken. It was just too full. Too soaked in consequence. Too stained with the weight of a single, irreversible act. You visited it once years later, asked a clerk for permission, said you were researching grain records. He let you in. The table stood under a sheet. You lifted it, ran your fingers across the top. One groove, deep, narrow, had never faded. You didn't need to wonder what made it. You placed your hand beside it, and for a moment, the chamber returned. The voices, the footsteps, the blade. You stepped back, covered the table again, and left. They say it was burned in a fire decades later, just old wood in a warehouse no one remembered. But you remember, not because it was sacred, but because it once held more than laws and ink. It held the moment Rome cracked, and no one could bear to place their hands there again. It didn't start right away, not the first year, not even the second. But slowly, strangely, without decree or planning, Rome began to pause at noon. It wasn't official. No herald announced it. No law required it. But when the bell rang, The tall one at the Temple of Concord struck daily at the sun's highest point. Something shifted. Voices dimmed. Hammers slowed. Horses paused at corners. Market bartering softened into murmurs. Just for a moment, just long enough for the echo of the bell to drift through the stone corridors, over rooftops, through the dust-laced air. You noticed it first while passing through the forum. The bell rang, and the man beside you, loud, red-faced, arguing over taxes, stopped mid-sentence. His hand hovered above his scroll. His mouth hung open, as if some invisible thread had tugged the words back inside. You looked around. No one moved. For 10, maybe 15 heartbeats, the entire square breathed as one shallow tight suspended. Then someone coughed. The noise returned, but not quite the same. It happened again the next day, and the day after. A boy, delivering grain to a bakery, dropped his sack at the stroke of the bell and stood still, staring at nothing. When asked what he was doing, he shrugged, listening. But to what? There were theories. Some said it was superstition that Caesar's ghost passed the forum at noon. Others said it was habit inherited through generations who didn't even know what they were remembering. You knew, because you had stood in that chamber when the sky split inside stone walls, and you remembered the moment the blade stopped. The silence after Caesar's last breath. Not triumph. Not panic. Not chaos. Just stillness. It was the loudest moment of your life. And now, somehow, centuries later, it had returned not in screams or statues, but in the crack between chimes. The bell rang, and Rome, for a breathless instant, stood still again. Not in grief, not in reverence, but in echo. Because sometimes history doesn't shout, it pauses. He didn't mean to watch it burn. The order came at dusk. Purge the irrelevant. The archive master didn't argue. Too many scrolls, not enough room. Mice, moisture, fire was faster. So the clerk, Young's quiet good with dates, but poor with context, began sorting through the pile. Most were mundane grain levies, naval rosters, trade figures. Then one caught his eye. No title, no author, no seal. Just a single line at the top, on the death of Gaius Julius Caesar. He unrolled it slowly. The parchment crackled like dry leaves. Inside names, notes, descriptions, a map of the curia, a line drawing of where the senators stood. Your name was there, faint, nearly smudged, followed by a single mark, an X. He stared at it too long. By the time the bell rang, he was the last left in the room. He carried the scroll to the flame, paused. The fire hissed. He held it over the coals. And then a shape moved. Not in the flame, but in the smoke. A silhouette, broad-shouldered, robed, not dancing, not flickering, just standing, watching him. He blinked. It didn't vanish. The parchment trembled in his hands. He felt heat on his face, ash in his throat. He dropped the scroll. Watched it curl and blacken and vanish. The shape with it. Gone. He didn't sleep that night. He told no one, but the next morning he returned to the fire pit. Nothing remained, not even a fragment. But when he opened his logbook to record the day's disposals, he found something. A single smudge of ash, shaped like a dagger, pointing left. He stared at it for a long time. Then closed the book without writing a word. He would go on to copy hundreds of records. Laws, births, deeds, but he never touched a document about Caesar again. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Because some truths refused to vanish even in flame. It was a market day. The forum buzzed with the weight of midsummer citrus peels on stone vendors shouting over amphory children weaving through sandal-strapped crowds with dust-streaked joy. You hadn't planned to stop. You were older now, slower, nearly invisible. But then you heard it. A whisper, faint, off to your right, near the shade of the old statue. You turned. Two young men stood hunched over a ledger. One laughed. The other shook his head. Then quietly, too quietly for either to fully realize what had escaped his lips, one of them said, "Let's not wait. Now is the hour. The knives are ready." Your chest tightened. You stepped back into the shadow of a column. The words were almost casual. Spoken like a joke, a quote from some half-remembered drama, something borrowed, recycled, said without meaning. But you had heard them before. Word for word, in that room. On that morning, from a voice just behind you, trembling, but resolute. You remembered the tone. You remembered the way Brutus looked at you just before it was spoken, the way his mouth moved a second before his blade did. And now, somehow the sentence had survived, not in scrolls, not in law, but in breath. You watched the boys walk away, laughing unaware. They didn't know the weight of what they'd said, didn't know that words can rot in walls and still bloom. You stepped forward, almost called out. But what would you say? That phrase once spilled blood. That sentence shattered the Republic. Be careful what ghosts you summon. Instead, you watched them vanish down the alley. And you whispered the words to yourself, once more. Softly, not in fear, not in memory, but in recognition. Because history doesn't always repeat. Sometimes it simply reminds. You've heard the line 100 times, et tu brute, even you, Brutus. It echoes through schoolbooks, theater stages, films. The moment Caesar sees his closest ally raise a dagger and utters those 3 Latin words before falling. A perfect betrayal. A perfect line. But it's not real. There's no historical record that Caesar ever said it. Suetonius, the Roman biographer, claims Caesar said nothing, that he simply pulled his toga over his face. Plutarch suggested he may have gasped. Others believed he tried to fight back. But none of the ancient sources, not the ones closest to the moment, record that famous phrase. The line comes from Shakespeare. And it's good, really good. It captures everything the public wanted the moment to mean: heartbreak, betrayal, drama, theater. It paints Brutus as both villain and victim, and Caesar as dignified, even in death. It wraps up chaos in a sentence so clean it feels like closure. But what if the silence was the truth? What if Caesar didn't speak at all? What if the man who ruled an empire died in shock, breathless, wordless, surrounded not by poetry, but by panic? You were there. You remember the sound of sandals slipping, the huff of breath, the wet slap of blood hitting stone. And not once, not even once, did he say your name. Sometimes, history adds words to moments that were already loud enough. That's what you told yourself. That it wasn't personal, that it wasn't about pride or fear or power. It was about the Republic. The Republic ancient, noble, orderly, where no man ruled alone, where law trumped blood, where tradition protected balance. You believed in it. Brutus believed in it. Cassius claimed to. But if you're honest, truly honest, in this quiet moment, long after it all ended, you know it wasn't so simple. Some conspirators hated Caesar because he passed them over for promotion. Some feared what his popularity meant for their legacy. Some wanted to be remembered as defenders of Rome, not for what they did, but for the name they left behind. Even you, what were you saving? The Republic hadn't been pure for decades. Corruption was everywhere. Senators bribed voters in daylight. Courts bowed to wealth. Armies answered to generals, not the Senate. And Caesar, yes, he was dangerous. But so were the men who called him dangerous. So were you. You told yourself the knife would restore something, but it didn't. The Republic didn't return. It collapsed faster. And what came next wasn't freedom. It was empire born from the ashes of what you thought you'd protect. Maybe some of you meant well. Maybe some of you still believe it mattered. But in the end, the Republic died not from one man seizing power. It died from many men, each convinced they were the only one who could save it. It's a tempting story, that violence can be clean, that killing, if done for the right reasons, becomes noble. They wrote poems about Brutus. They carved statues for Cassius. In time, even the word tyrannicide, the slaying of a tyrant, became something honorable. But you know the truth. Because you were there. And there was nothing noble about it. It wasn't swift. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't just one strike and a quiet fall. It was panic. It was shouting and missed blows. It was too many hands, too little coordination. It was slipping in blood. It was Brutus's face twisted with something between doubt and horror. It was someone vomiting after. It was someone else sobbing before it was even done. You didn't feel heroic. You felt hollow, and afterward. No crowds cheered. No garlands were thrown. People stared. Some fled. Some watched from windows and closed their shutters. Later, others would romanticize it, say it was necessary, say you saved something greater. But in that room, in that moment, it didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like a loss, not just of a man, but of something harder to name. The myth says Caesar died like a villain and you walked away like patriots. But myths need symmetry. History needs mess. And you didn't kill a monster. You killed a man, and none of you were saints. You thought they would thank you, the people, the merchants, the farmers, the soldiers in dusty cloaks who crowded the forum for bread and coin and promises. You told yourselves they wanted liberty from tyranny, from crowns, from one man holding too much. But they didn't. They wanted stability. They wanted their grain shipments on time. They wanted their tax collectors to show up only once. They wanted their streets clean and their families fed. And Caesar, for all his ambition, for all his flaws, had given them that. Cheap bread, land for veterans, games to distract from pain. You gave them chaos. After the Ides, the prices rose. The forum filled not with celebration, but smoke. The calendar turned, and no one could tell if Rome was safer or simply more afraid. They didn't chant your names. They whispered them in alleyways in fear. And when Antony rose and Octavian followed, and the Republic faded into empire, they cheered. Because emperors at least kept the grain moving. You thought the people wanted what you wanted. But they didn't. They didn't want the idea of the Republic. They wanted the feeling of Rome still standing. And they didn't care who held the reins, so long as the cart moved forward. Maybe that's not weakness. Maybe that's survival. But it meant that when you raised your blade for freedom, they didn't see a liberator. They saw a man who made their lives less predictable. And Rome never forgives that. Let's not talk about me for a moment. Let's talk about you. Imagine it's the year 44 BC. You are not a senator, not yet, but you're rising. You've studied rhetoric. You've watched elections rigged. You've seen crowds cheer louder for games than for laws. You know the Republic is fading, not in fire, but in fatigue. And now there's Caesar. He's powerful, beloved by the people, feared by the elite. He walks through the forum like he owns it. They offer him a crown. He declines it, but with a smirk. You're told he must be stopped. You're invited into a circle of men with sharp minds and tired eyes. They quote Cato. They whisper about restoring balance. They tell you it must be now, it must be swift, it must be you too. Would you agree? Would you stand in a room with a man who once praised you, once welcomed you, once called you by name and raise your hand? Would you do it not with hatred, but with trembling loyalty to something abstract? Would you tell yourself it's for the greater good? Would you strike, knowing history might call you savior or traitor? Or would you hesitate? Would you walk away and let someone else decide the fate of Rome? There's no right answer, only the one that lets you sleep. And even then, not always. You've seen it happen. The same hands that once tore names off stone later commissioned sculptures of the very men they cursed. You saw Brutus's name whispered in alleyways, then decades later carved into the side of a theater, misquoted, misunderstood. You saw Caesar burned in effigy by men who feared him, then worshipped in marble by their sons. You watched people forget why they hated someone and remember only how he made them feel. History is strange that way. It punishes in the moment, then forgives in bronze. It condemns with fire, then honors with fountains. You can kill a man, you can silence a movement, but you cannot control what comes after. You tried. You thought the blade would end it, but the blade only began it. Because in time, names blur, motives twist, and memory bows not to truth, but to story. The traitor becomes a reformer, the rebel becomes a martyr, the murderer becomes a myth, and the statue. It rises in the Forum not because the man was right, but because someone needed him to be. The statues are still there, some of them. Brutus, Cassius, Caesar. They stand in corners of forgotten gardens, tucked between newer emperors, their noses chipped, their arms missing, pigeons nesting in the folds of their togas. Children don't know their names. Guides rush past them on the way to livelier myths. And the marble, it's fading. The inscriptions have softened, the edges have blurred. Rain has done what rhetoric never could. Rome, too, has softened. The Curia stands, but it's a museum now. Tourists shuffle across its floors, not knowing where the blood fell. They take pictures of pillars, buy replicas of daggers in gift shops. The chamber echoes differently. Not with speeches, but with sneakers. Laughter. Cameras. And beneath it all, a stillness. You feel it in the dust. The kind that settles in corners and carries things no one can name. Not guilt, not glory, just fragments. That's what's left. Not the Republic, not the Empire, not even the betrayal. Just stone and dust and silence. It doesn't shout anymore. Not like it used to, with trumpets and speeches and sandals stamping across marble. Rome has grown older, softer, but it still whispers. In the early morning, when the air is cool and the stone is damp, you can hear it. In the gaps between footsteps, in the hush after a bell chimes, in the way shadows stretch across old walls just before the sun crests. The city doesn't remember your name, but something in it does. The cracks in the Curia's floor still follow the same pattern. The ivy still avoids one column, the one nearest where Caesar fell. The dust gathers thickest on the bench where Brutus once sat. Coincidence, maybe. But you feel it. Rome remembers in the way skin remembers a scar, not with stories, but with sensation. It winces even now when people speak too loudly in certain places. It holds its breath when tourists wander too close to the old stones. It knows. Not what happened exactly, not the why, but that something once broke here. And no matter how many new roads are laid, how many fountains built, how many names carved, there is always that faint voice beneath it all. This is where it changed, and it never quite lets go. You were never a hero, nor a villain. Just a man, with fears, with doubts, with moments you wish you could forget. You walked the same streets as everyone else, felt the same chill in the mornings, tasted the same bitter bread. You made choices, terrible, desperate, impossible choices. Sometimes brave, sometimes cowardly. Sometimes you believed you were right. Sometimes you knew you were wrong, but you were human. And that is enough. No monument will capture your trembling hands. No statue will hold your silent prayers. No song will sing your story in full. Because history remembers men in halves. The brave and the fallen, the winners and the lost, but never the whole. You carry the weight of that, not with glory, not with shame, but with the quiet acceptance of a man who lived and who died. Like any other, though you were just a man, your actions rippled far beyond the moment. A single knife, a single choice, a single breath, and the course of history bent. Empires rose from the ashes you helped kindle. Kings crowned themselves in the shadow of your blade. The republic you thought you saved, it was gone. Replaced by something new, different, unforgiving, stronger. You may have vanished from the scrolls. Your name may have faded from the stones. But the world you knew, that world changed forever. Every law written, every throne claimed, every battle fought since then, they all carry your mark. Not in glory, not in fame, but in the quiet turning of the wheel. Sometimes, when the night is still and the wind soft, you can almost hear the echoes of your choice, reminding you that history is not made by those who watch, but by those who act. You're not in Rome anymore. Not in that crowded chamber. Not on those cold marble floors. Not beneath that heavy, silent sky. You've left the past behind, or at least you will. Close your eyes. Feel your breath, the air around you, the weight of your body sinking into the mattress. Let the echoes fade. Let the dust settle. The world moves on. You're here, safe, warm. The knives are gone. The voices are quiet. And the night embraces you. You're no longer a man hunted by ghosts. You're just you, here, breathing. You're here, not in a chamber filled with whispers and blood. Not in the shadow of marble statues or broken ideals. You're breathing, calmly, slowly. The world around you hums softly, the gentle rise and fall of your chest, the faint rhythm of your heartbeat. There is peace. No longer the weight of history pressing down, no longer the knife poised in trembling hands, just the quiet. A quiet that holds you gently. You are safe. Safe in the present, safe in your skin. And when sleep finds you, as it will carry you gently through the night. Because here now, you are not alone. You are home,